accept that the idea of scientific rationality, and we'll see what rationality is, and I'll try and clarify exactly what I mean by rationality. Even if I accept scientific rationality is a way to discover truths about the world, about nature, about laws of physics and chemistry and biology and so on, what does it mean to invoke that idea of scientific rationality to understand motivations of people's action, to understand nature of social processes? In other words, the question you're asking is, if scientific rationality is a way of rationally understanding the natural world around us, what kind of rationality can do a same or similar job in making sense of social action? So for that, we'll have to believe scientific rationality in principle cannot do the job of explaining social processes like it does so effectively in the context of describing the world. So I want to just work with you a little bit to see whether this argument is tenable, and if it is, what kind of rationalities you're really looking at. So I will just start with two very basic questions which I'll keep in the back and as a background question by asking a very simple question: what is it to be rational? You come and tell me you behave rationally. I want to know, what do you want me to do? Then I can try and do it. Secondly, what is the benefit of being rational? In the context of human skills, and especially since we are in a very important educational institution, we know what the benefit of education is. You may get jobs. I think most students think they get education for jobs. Some people think they get skills. So you may get various things. If you are, for example, benefit of being kind, you may think there are some benefit of being kind. Maybe other people will be kind to you and so on. So if you look at these various qualities which we possess and there's a benefit of them, what really is the benefit of being rational? Who is it benefiting? What is the benefit for me to be rational? Or what is the benefit for a society if all of us behave rationally? In the context of the social sciences, it is a second question which is extremely important, which we will see very shortly. So I want to begin with a very interesting dilemma in the very idea of the rational. So as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, the word idea rational itself has a mathematical origin, which we know very well from the idea of ratio, and it comes from in the context of the European civilization, post-Greek civilization, it comes from a very simple metaphysical argument, a philosophical belief about the nature of numbers, that numbers, the best numbers are numbers which are rational, which can be expressed as A by B. And these numbers had a quality. Rational numbers have a special quality which are, in a sense, human, if you like. So the good numbers, if you like, the good numbers are ones which are expressed as A by B, are rational numbers, are ratios. The bad numbers are the irrational numbers. Much before anybody called you irrational, they have already called square root of 2 as irrational. So it doesn't matter if you're called irrational because you are in good company with square root of 2. And why is square root of 2 called irrational? There's a wonderful, very simple proof by Pythagoras on why it can't be expressed as A by B. And that idea of irrationality of numbers, just this principle, which is related very deeply to this Greek cosmology of the way they understood the world, the way they understood the nature of numbers, was, because it was related to that, square root of 2 also had negative qualities, including a very negative quality of being feminine. That's again a very important point. There is very little which has changed in the idea of rationality. And that's the dilemma we want to begin with. One, its fundamental association with some idea of mathematics. And two, far more troubling, its fundamental relationship with the idea of God. So, with the idea of God. So these are the two issues. In fact, if there's a model for rationality, what it means to be rational and why we should be rational, the first model comes from, on the one hand, mathematics, on the other hand, the idea of God. So I'll just give you very briefly how that actually happens and why there was this shift into privileging this idea of the rational. The rational is privileged for various reasons. One of the most important reasons is this. It's privileged because it is the way by which human beings can get absolutely certain knowledge. So certainty is grounded in rationality. As against what? This debate, which really defines the origin of Western philosophy, European philosophy, which influences what scientific rationality is. I'm invoking the question of European philosophy here because the debate on what scientific rationality, the nature of scientific knowledge, comes from this debate. And what is this debate? The debate, very simply put, again, which I'm sorry if I'm repeating, for which most of you may know about this, the debate is very simple, that there are ways of knowing things about the world. One way of knowing is experiencing the world. From your experiences, you know something about the world. The other way of knowing about the world is just thinking in a very loose sense. So I'm very happy to see thought and action. That's really the fundamental essence of rationality, because the question is this: by thinking alone, can I get knowledge? Can I get even better knowledge than experiencing the world? So the two possibilities are knowledge which is grounded on experience, as against knowledge which is grounded just on cogitation, just on pure thinking, if you like. And given this, it was very easy to see who lost the race. Given this, the way in which the question was framed, it is impossible for experience or the sensory experience, knowledge based on experience, to win the game, because everybody knows, whether you don't have to be a philosopher to do that, that you can't trust perception. Perceptual knowledge, sensory knowledge is always incomplete, it is always hallucinatory, it can be illusionary, gives me perspectives, every way I look at it, you look different. You can't trust your eyes, and therefore you can't trust your perception. Whereas, as against it, there seems to be this great possibility that you could generate knowledge just by pure thought alone, and not only that, the two of the greatest examples of absolutely certain knowledge, knowledge which is indubitable, knowledge without doubt, comes from such thinking. One is mathematical knowledge, and two is knowledge about God. And this is something very special to the Greek, post-Greek, European tradition. I'm just caricaturing a very large, complex history. But it is very specific to that tradition. Why? Because mathematical knowledge was not seen to be knowledge which arises from the sensation. It is not empirical. In fact, even today, one of the greatest questions in philosophy of mathematics and understanding the nature of rationality of mathematics comes from this point, that mathematical knowledge is not coming from my experience of the world. I do not learn 2 plus 2 equal to 4 because I add 2 plus 2 4. And I'm sure many of you who are educationists here know the importance of this question in teaching mathematics and how it's become a central question in mathematical education. Now, if on the one hand you have a tradition of philosophers who believe that mathematical knowledge comes in some sense of not only some kind of introspective action and not dependent on the messiness of the world, and not only that, two of the greatest sources of pure, true certain truths, universal truths. I mean, this is a story we have rehashed for thousands of years, that without learning how to ask the critical question about it. When we say, for example, 2 plus 2 equal to 4 is universal, it does not matter who is reading it, which culture is doing it, etc., etc. You'll have to find out the argument for it. Why would we say that 2 plus 2 equal to 4? In what sense do we say that 2 plus 2 is 4 across cultures? That it is not like the fact that I may have a truth that people here might like idlis, but people in Africa might hate idlis, and that's a very subjective truth. There's nothing truthful about the fact that idlis are a great dish or not. What I'm trying to say is, if mathematics is allowing you that possibility, that you can understand and access these kind of truths which are universal, which are independent of cultures, then you have a great challenge to say, how do you make sense of the empirical world? And in fact, if there is one common philosophical debate which leads to the question of scientific rationality, it is this idea which comes from the rational tradition. Now, it's only in the 17th, 18th century that you really see, this point about the 16th to 17th, 18th century are extremely important because it gives you the defining debate in Europe, leads to some of the most important new philosophies which lay the foundation for understanding the nature of knowledge itself, the nature of scientific knowledge, and so on. And this, if you look at a very quick history of Western philosophy, you will see that there are this group of people who are often called as a rationalists. There are people who are the first rationalists before anybody in India became rationalists, by these 4 chaps. One is Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz. All 4 of them extremely influential figures. Particularly Leibniz is an extremely influential figure, not just for philosophy, but for mathematics. Descartes is a mathematician who uses his very, very influential mathematician, all the Cartesian system you follow up from him, and who also inaugurates this new modern philosophy in a sense. So here you have This classification by philosophers in history of philosophy as the rationalists. And what is their concern? Their concern is how can philosophy give you these true insights about the world, true and necessary truths which are necessary. And this is in fact the power of rationality. The power of rationality is this. On the one hand, it is this privilege of thinking of some kind, but on the other hand, it is also a capacity to go beyond the empirical. And that's a very important insight from rationality, which is that the if you depend only on experience and senses, you are not going to get all the knowledge that you can get out of the world. Rationality is a way of adding things which are not present in your empirical experience. So a very simple thing, like when I see one person is sitting to the left of another, empirically there are just two people who are sitting. My capacity to be able to add new qualities to that is rational knowledge. It's not, I can't see Rohit sitting to the left, for example. I have to be able to add that kind of a conceptual category in order to describe the world. And in fact, this is the crucial point about rationality, is that the very idea of necessity, that is necessary truths, essential truths, all come from a rational project. In other words, to know, if we depend only on experience, I can know what I see and that's all there is to it. I cannot say things like, this is essential character of you and not an accidental character. This is necessary and not a contingent part of the world. This is what it really means to be that. Where do these ideas come from? Empiricism cannot guarantee you or even give you insights into these ideas. So if the truest truth or the highest form of truth are truths about your true essence or your essential character of people or the necessary truths which do not change just because context change, then rationality is the path, the tool which will enable you to get hold of these truths. And therefore, we know that there's a very important task which rationality is doing, and as I said, with mathematics as a model, it's extremely important. So what does rationality in this sense do? It gives to you the ideas of unity, ideas of coherence, gives you the idea of simplicity, gives you the idea of necessity, gives you the idea of essentiality, and so on. Extremely important ways by which we make sense of the world. Without it, you can see why all these terms I'm talking about are also very important principles in science. Even though science, the great debate between rationalism and empiricism comes between this debate between the primacy of rational knowledge versus empirical knowledge, the creation of science as a discipline, the creation of science as a domain of thinking is not reduced to just a set of experiences. Science is not a description of experiences, a collection of experiences. It's the capacity to add a rational structure on the empirical world. What we would call as theory, what you call largely as theory and logical structures of science or mathematical structures of science. You know, the early beginnings of physics begins with the idea by Galileo that world is an open book written in the language of mathematics, and the task of a scientist is to just write that down. So in other words, all scientists had to be mathematicians. And look at the irony. Science is about the empirical world, and that was a great challenge to Leibniz and others. But science as a discipline, science as a special kind of a knowledge system can only happen when rationalist categories are put on this empirical world. So given this, you can ask this simple question. The first step into many rationalities is to ask the question, is this view of rational universal? I mean, I think this is a useful picture. It is telling us why we need to understand what we mean by rational, why it is useful, the importance of it, etc. But is it universal? Did all cultures think about it? And I'm not saying all cultures should think about it. There is no reason, like the British thought, maybe Indian culture, Indian people did not have capacity for any of this. Maybe. Or like Hegel says, women don't have the capacity to do. They can be taught, they can be educated, but you cannot really expect them to do philosophy, logic, and the sciences, and so on. So maybe those are true. Okay, don't take me seriously. I'm just trying to be rhetorical here. Because for you to see that point, because I'm just setting the ground for asking the question, is it possible for there to be alternate ways of rationality, or is this the only definition of rationality? Is this the power of rationality? Now, this itself is a very interesting question, because I don't want to go into the many rationalities for a particular reason, because very often people then tend to confuse that with relativism and things like that. I'm trying to seriously push at one point about rationality and social rationality. I'll just make the point that this is not universal. Why? Not universal in a historical sense. I'm not even talking about in a conceptual sense, okay? It's not historical because you have a very strong and powerful system of thought which is loosely classified in the Indian philosophical systems. And if you look at the different Indian philosophical systems which deal with the question of rationality, if you look at the Nyaya, it's called as a school of logic. The Nyaya Buddhist debates, one of the most important interesting work which I have seen in philosophical texts is a debate about nature of inference and what we call as logic and reason and so on. But if you look at the Indian philosophical system, what has been pointed out by many scholars is that the idea of necessity and a priori, which are markers of the rational, are not present. In Indian philosophical texts, there is no distinction. There is the rational empirical debate, which was such an important debate, which in a sense opens up the whole Kantian project and post-Kantian project, doesn't appear. There is no mention of the rational and the possibility of the empirical. There is no mention of the fact that the tussle between them is really the serious philosophical puzzle we should all make sense of. And in a way we can understand this, because the two most examples of rational, the logical, what it means to be logical, which is a very good example of being rational, and the question of mathematics are both dealt with very differently in Indian logical philosophical systems. Many of you know that the question of logic is empirical, that logic is not about a formal structure, but it's all about the world in a very fundamental sense, is one common way in which people have described Indian logic. But more importantly, I just want to point out about the very intriguing question of Indian mathematics. Because, I mean, there are a lot of interesting implications about it, but I'm not, that opens up a completely different question. I'm only talking about the relationship between Indian mathematics and philosophy. As I said, if there is one domain which influences very deeply the nature of Western philosophy, that which I think most of us are products of, because a modern education is a direct product of the concerns of the Western Enlightenment and the European project of so on. So that's the only reason why we will have to take them very seriously. If there is one theme which is so common across from, in the Enlightenment period and pre-Enlightenment period from the Greeks, it is the theme of mathematics. And the fact that mathematics has its own theology and metaphysics. Again, people have pointed out, very much more powerfully than I can in these two sentences, how the mathematical imagination of the Greeks and post-Enlightenment, till the Enlightenment period, is actually very closely enmeshed with theological arguments. The question of God is not very different, is not very far from the question of mathematics. And the question of mathematics is central to the question of the rational. By saying this, I'm not trying to negate the question of what is it to be rational. I'm trying to point out to the complexity. What is the idea of rational struggling with? And I think much of what we talk about today in these kinds of events in India which are happening now are primarily about that. That same tension is manifesting itself in various different ways. So, if the question of ideas of infinity, why is it that it's so important? Mathematics is theological. A very good example of Cantor, who calls this one of the greatest ideas in mathematics on the transfinite cardinals as a garden of paradise. His discovery of these elements of these transfinite cardinals as being creatures in a garden of paradise. The theological elements in many of these mathematicians' imagination is very strong. And at some level, we need to make sense of it, perhaps not here. But more importantly, the idea of the fact that finite humans can have a notion of infinite is a very important philosophical puzzle for them. And it is a puzzle which is at the heart of the way the rationalists, those who are called as rationalists in the rational Western philosophical tradition, the way they respond to the question of God. Okay? Now, this is the point which we need to very briefly understand, because there is something, when I say Indian mathematics does not have these presuppositions, what I'm also trying to say is Indian philosophy completely ignores Indian mathematics. It is not asking the question which was so important for Plato onwards, what is the nature of number? What kind of entities are numbers? What is the being of mathematical terms? That question doesn't arise. Indian mathematics for Indians was just a question of measurement and doing. It was never a point of conceptual, not a way of being at all. In other words, mathematics as a model for rationality never occurs in the Indian traditions. In fact, it's a puzzle which I've been trying to understand and maybe look at. It's very difficult to get some of the texts in this. The complete, ignoring this question of mathematics in the long tradition of philosophical debates in India. And that is a very serious consequence, because it makes the question of rationalism go in two different ways. Now, if you looked at the question of the point about rationalists, is that for all these rationalists, Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza and Leibniz, the principle of God is very central to their definition of the rational. As I said, for example, to make sense of very simple ideas like infinity, perfection, unity and so on, and therefore it leads us to consider a very paradoxical point. Again, I'm sorry, it would be great to discuss all these points in greater detail, but just to open up some new thoughts about the idea of rational, which is what? Consider the possibility that for the rationalists, the model for rationality is God, which is God is the most rational being. If there is any notion of rationality to the description and the creation of the world, including the scientific world, to them, the people from whom we get the idea of rationality, it is based on the fact that God is not only the most rational being, but rationality of humans is grounded in the rationality of God. So how do we make sense of this? Now, when I'm saying all this, you should also note that the idea of God itself is very different. It is held in different ways, even by these four the rationalists and so on. But I'm just invoking this. It may sound very polemical, but I'm doing it to show you that what is special about the rational is a special engagement with the transcendental, the capacity to go beyond whatever is presented before you. You want to call it God, you want to call it something else, it doesn't matter. You can call it laws of nature. When science does the transcendental move, what it does is it looks at the world of empirical phenomena and then says there is something transcendental beyond what you see. That going beyond is crucial. What is the nature of going beyond? How do we conceptualize this just going beyond what appears before you? So laws of nature is a going beyond, because science discovers that there are laws under which all objects in nature obey, under which they probably govern how nature works. And this is at least the way in which scientists describe it. That discovery of the transcendental is a very important act of the rational. So, given that these kinds of relations are very problematic in the context of rational, but also hopefully understanding its importance as a very special human capacity, the question which interested me for a very long time, and I'm glad to bring that long years of deliberation on this. I've had one debate on this at EPW with Meera Nanda much earlier, but this is actually something far more in the nature of the idea of the rational. To me, the pragmatic question, and this I must say is a question which, as Bhupendra was mentioning, my work with Gopal Guru, which we did as Crack Mirror, this is a very important question which we are working on now. And this has been a thing which I've been thinking about for a long time, so I'm very glad to have this opportunity to reflect on this, which is not the question about scientific rationality. I mean, I don't think there is any doubt between any of us about the importance of any notion of scientific rationality. It's an extremely important way of doing things with the world, knowing things about the world. But the simple question is this, in the context of the kinds of movements we are seeing, and the question is, how does, I'm asking a question about what we might take for granted. So I want to phrase it carefully. How does scientific rationality matter for social and human action? So even if I grant you that scientific rationality is the only way in which I can discover natural laws and how chemicals react and genetics and so on, how does it matter to make sense of your action and my action? How we relate to people, how we relate to others, and what it means to be a society. Now, this has been my point about many of these groups, I must add here. And my point about many of these groups is, I feel that if only they had not restricted themselves to a very, very limited understanding of scientific rationality, they could have actually have broadened this debate. What do I mean by that? By this, I mean that this invocation in a very limited sense of scientific rationality has not taken into account the extremely rich and for decades, more than many, many decades of work in the social sciences on rationality. See, this question about what is the rational structure of social action and individual action in society is not a new one. So, this is a question which has been dealt with in social science to a great detail, and without invoking the question of scientific rationality, there is the idea of scientific rationality is at the heart of many of these ways of looking at rationality. They are actually engaging with the question of what is rationality to do with the social. In other words, when I want to ask this question, how does I'm not saying whether it is, I'm presuming it, I'm saying how does it matter? I want to begin with the nature of the social, because we are talking about social issues and social problems, particular ways in which citizens of our society, certain set of beliefs, the particular kind of actions they do and so on. So if you want to ask the question about what is the social first, before asking what kind of rationality makes sense of social. Now, if you do that, then we can just ask so here I will now define to you what rationality is, because it is immediately useful for me here, and I think we've been talking about rationality as something to do with knowledge and so on. I'll just give you very quickly one line sentence, and there's a lot of debate about what exactly constitutes rationality, etc. As Habermas points out in a very interesting article by Dahlmeier, that, well, in a sense, rationality is about knowledge. That's really not it's something to do with knowledge. But what is it specifically? It is not just related to knowledge as content, which is what the content of knowledge is, right? Whether 2 plus 2 is 4 or whether there are ghosts. But more importantly, it is about how we acquire and utilize that knowledge. That is, rationality is a process, a particular way of reaching something, not those content of what we call this as bits of knowledge and so on. How do you acquire it and how do you utilize it? That process of know how we do it is also, as Batten points out, the rationality is essentially nothing but a structure of justification. And justification, not justification of our beliefs, but the justification of the process, or rationality is nothing but the process which leads to justified beliefs. There are certain things we believe in, and there's a process for believing in them. So whether I want to believe in the existence of chair or ghosts or two numbers, 2 plus 2, or the set of numbers, then it's not just a question of what things I believe in, but the way in which I justified those beliefs, whether for me or for you and so on. Now, if starting with that particular question, then rationality in social setup, in terms of social action, is just about how we act. What are the processes of justification in action? And justification is actually a fundamental idea, not just in the context of scientific rationality, but in the very possibility of social action. And that's a very interesting debate which I won't get into. I'll just point out to you very quickly the different kinds of rationalities which social scientists have used. Because you could use these to really look, and these are things which I've, as I said, done for a very long time, starting with Weber, of course, a very important sociologist, whose definition of rationality, who is also following certain models of rationality which are, in a sense, you can map with ideas of scientific rationality. But for Weber, the idea of a society is just this. The idea of a society is a set of individuals who are there, but that which is formed through rational interaction between them. So if you just have a room of individuals who have no interaction between them, an idea of the social or the society is not formed. The idea of a society is formed not just through any interaction, not just through behavior and so on, but through a kind of interaction between each of us. In fact, we make society by interacting with each other, but interact rationally with each other. So you can see right from a very important influence of understanding in the social sciences on what really constitutes a society is already predicated on some notion of rationality, which is this rational interaction. So Weber does this 4 different types of actions and so on, which so most of you would know, but very quickly, just for completeness, let me tell you what they are. So Weber is focusing on the question of meaningful action as against just behaviors, and in the meaningful action, he points out that the 4 meaningful actions are, or what you would call a social action, that is action towards others, and the 4 types of these meaningful action or social action would be the tradition, that which comes from the traditional which comes from the traditions, and to the affectual, that actions which are driven by emotions, because many of our actions could be done by emotions, And then the two others, which are very important for him in his context of social rationality, which is called valuing action and the practical action. And you can, like somebody, like another sociologist like Kalberg points out that you can break this up into 4 types of rationalities itself. So the social rationality which he is talking about, based on the last 2 types of meaningful actions of Weber, can be broken up. I know I'm rushing through, but I just want to give you an idea of what it is, that the way in which sociologists have looked at it. So the 4 types of rationalities would be practical, theoretical, formal, and substantive. Now the idea here is just this, that where does the question of rationality come in? That if we act, so humans act for a variety of reasons. We may act based on some impetus of tradition, we may act based on our emotions, we may act based on doing certain things which we value, which we may think is good to do it, and so we act in that particular manner, or we may act on just means and thing, what do I get out of doing something. And that's a kind of a rationality which, as many of you might know, becomes a defining rationality for economics. And the fact that we are all, so for economics, the very basic theory of economics, the modeling of it begins with the fact that we are rational actors, that we act in order to maximize our benefits. That's one particular way, and that's a model of rationality. It's not necessarily a model of rationality which is the scientific rationality. In other words, 2 objects do not interact with each other in order to maximize their benefits. They'll only interact with each other according to Newton's laws of motion. But 2 humans would interact with each other in order to maximize their benefit, if you look at this instrumental rationality argument. So the point is, when it comes to human interactions and social interactions, the kind of rational processes, the kind of justifications for our actions which we do are far more complex. They are far more complex than what scientific rationality can ever hope to capture, for the simple reason that there is an agency and motivation for human action which is not present for agency and motivation of natural objects. Now, unless we understand social action through this essential definition of being human, then the question of invoking scientific rationality as a cure for social problems will still remain, it will remain a very important project, but it will still be limited. In other words, the capacity for it to become more important is only if you add to that primary notion of scientific rationality very important ideas of these social rationalities by which you can actually have meaningful social change. So, for example, social science, philosophy of social science at least does this extensive list of different kinds of rationalities. You have the rational choice theory, you have symbolic interactionism, which then is leads on to a very important work, of course, by Peter Winch, following the philosopher Wittgenstein, on rationality as rule following. So perhaps what you're doing when you're being rational. So these are answers to the question, what do you do when you're asked to be rational? Or if somebody says, oh, you're a rational being, what have you done? So if you rule follow, is that a kind of rationality? Is that the rationality we have in social settings? Some people could also argue that is the fact of the, if 2 objects interact with each other and work, follow the laws of equations of motion, for example, or follow the laws of gravity and so on, are they just rule following that law? Are they just following that law? In what sense? Can humans, when humans have to follow rules, we have to interpret. And therefore, as you can see, in this long tradition of looking at different rationalities in the social sciences, the hermeneutic rationalities becomes very important. The question of language becomes extremely central. Now, both of these are very problematical ways of, within, if you restrict our notions of rationality to the scientific rationality alone. So, how do humans engage with each other? If we engage with each other through the question of language, then what is the idea of rationality present within our use of language in the means of communication? So, a very important development like Habermas's communicative action is a very important way of taking this into account, that rationality can be grounded in the communicative acts of people. In other words, if you really like, I can actually sit and discuss with you, I can debate with you. This question which Rohit was saying before the talk about the public intellectual, a piece by Romila Thapar, which I just received, which I haven't read, the point is also about what is happening to the space of public intellectuals in India, and whether, I'm just quoting what Rohit said because I haven't read it, on whether, this kind of rational debate is only possibility of saving the public space in India today, given the present context. Now, so invoking that kind of rationality is not to invoke a kind of scientific rationality. And it's very important for Romila Thapar to invoke that rationality because it gives us a way of meaningful action, meaningful social action, and meaningful social change without reducing humans to objects. And if there is a philosophical challenge to rationality, and one which it has to engage with consistently in this project, it is this, this constant struggle not to reduce all of us to statistics. It's very useful. In fact, when sociology largely becomes quantitative sociology, there is there's great power in reduction of us into units and numbers and so on. But if philosophical social sciences, if you like, and I think all of social sciences in a sense philosophically driven, conceptually at least, then this resistance to reduction of human beings to objects becomes, I think you have to take that on board. There's no way of going around it. And if you cannot reduce human beings to objects, then the question of how can scientific rationality be invoked to understand human beings if they are not just inanimate objects? So in this sense, we would look at all of this, and I will just try and conclude with this so that we can have a few minutes for any comments if you want. And I think all of this, the ideas of critical rationality, we should remember that, which I hope some of these rationalists, big movements in India will take a little more seriously, is that there have been very influential schools in social sciences such as critical theory, whose critical theory begins with the argument that the task of doing social science is to change society, not just describe it. So, in reaction to the ideas of scientific description of nature, that the scientific description of nature, at least the so-called truths of nature, are just described. Whatever you do, I don't think any of us can change the fact that the gravitational law is m1 m2 by r squared. I would personally like it to be r cubed, but I can't think of a way to make, I don't know what to do to nature to make it m1 m2 by r cubed. But I can do changes to the social structures. I can do changes to social practice and social action. And therefore, and critical theory begins with that. So you have a huge mass of very important work on social sciences and social rationalities, which begins with asking how do you change society through looking at notions of rational action on society. In other words, they allow us a little more complex understanding of rationality. In a sense, when I'm talking of many rationalities, I'm not talking of multiple rationalities. I'm only talking of complex rationality, which is not reduced, which does not reduce the world to these objects which it can manipulate and do things with, but in a very fundamental sense to understand people and social action, and to ask somebody to say, don't do this, which all of us here in this room will say, yes, that's absurd, why would you do it? I'm sure all of us will say that, but to understand it in the context of rationality, I'm just saying you need a little bit more work on the idea of rationality, and scientific rationality in principle by itself may not be able to do the work. Now, because all of these ideas of rationality which I have listed out, including hermeneutics and so on, are based on some idea of human. And that's really the problem, and we know this very well. Humans are the problem in every sense of the word. And even in this, the idea of the human is the problem. Because, the idea of humans as rational begins with Aristotle, very important, and it comes through in various ways that humans are rational animals. That in some sense, humans can do something which animals can't, which is that they can rationally think. Very interestingly, without going into the details, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, that such similar kind of characterization of human does not happen in Asian traditions. You do not have descriptions of humans and animals, a distinction between humans and animals as one, humans only thinking and the animals don't think. All you have to do is read Panchatantra, tales to see how dogs and crows and everything thinks like human beings. So if you look at all these ideas of what are humans, all these social rationality theories are trying to define what is it to be a human. Economics is trying to model itself on, when it says rational choice theory, it's saying humans as rational actors. We always work to maximize our benefit. Pragmatism would look at people have purposes. We act because we have a purpose. We want something, we do something, and that's the rationality of our action. In the hermeneutical sense, Weber and post-Weberian thing of hermeneutics, you would say people are meaning-creating animals. They are always in the constant process of meaning-creating. Umberto Eco calls humans as semiotic animals, this capacity to form signs and symbols and so on. So, for Habermas, they were communicating animals and so on. So, all these are essentially, all this question of rationality is coming back to the point we began with. what is special about the human means of just saying human mind, and that is your understanding of what a human being is really going to understand the model of rationality that you really want. What is the kind of rationality you need depends on how you want to look at what humans are, why do they act, what is their motivation to acting, and so on. So let me then wind up in the next few minutes by just making this final point. This is a point which okay, it's a little bit difficult to make in the sense that there may be many questions, and I'd be very glad to engage with it a little more in detail. But this is, so let me begin with this very troubling question, and I'm not very sure that I want to ask these questions, they are not very comfortable questions, because they have very many different interpretations, and I don't want to go into those domains of interpretations, which are these. So let me ask the simple question. If you want to talk about rationality of people, then we know rationality is about the process. A person who thinks there is a ghost is not being irrational per se, right? Per se. A scientist who believes that there are quarks which are not detectable by most of us is not being irrational per se. What is the point of irrationality? Is about the process of justification for those beliefs. So,
can you also replace that ghost with God?
Which goes with God?
The word ghost with
Yeah.
God, and then will that still, the sentence is still the same as you said?
Can you just replace it for me?
As in a person who says the concept of
Oh,
God
yes. Oh, you mean,
is
sorry.
rational per se,
Yeah.
but is not able to justify that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you could. So you could do that actually. But I mean, I'm using ghosts as a very careful term, which I presume none of us believe in ghosts in this room. Well, some of us might, but.
Ghost is less harmful because less powerful.
Okay.
It's a bigger thing to touch.
Yeah, so that's why I said, in case there are some of you who believe in ghosts, Rohit will take care of that. But for others, it's an easier thing to deal with ghosts. So, but the point is this, yeah, you could replace with anything. I could replace it, for example, why go to ghosts and quarks and so on? How many of us actually believe that there is something called time? So I could ask, what is the, to believe in time? Somebody might say, as Godel does in his latter part of his life when he gives this timeless universe model, you could say, well, there is nothing called time. And you could then ask, well, just the belief in the existence of time, is there a rational belief or not a rational belief? What I'm trying to say is, just asking that question is not going to take us too far. You better ask the other question about the nature of rationality, which is about the process of justification. So, well, there are very many interesting questions about time, space, etc. we can get into, and then the whole question of rational will become a problem. So let me ask these actual simpler questions, which is this. How do people become and act irrationally? How do they do it? What is the process? Not what they believe in, but how do they do it and why do they do it? Now, I think, I'm very glad that Sudesh started with the set of things which Dr. Dabholkar points about. The first slide, I think, stress and other things which makes people believe in superstition and so on. Now, all those can be psychological explanations. I want to give you an existential explanation. And I'm just trying to sound more deep than what it really is. It's basically a very simple thing. You believe in this, you react to this particular point. And this is a very human condition. It's just about, as I said, it's about the idea of defining of the human. And the human condition is the question of death and the point of desire. And if you look at the way in which human civilization has progressed in terms of its discourses and disciplines, including science and philosophy, both of them are trying to make sense of these two completely irrational terms called death and desire. There is much that is irrational in the very idea of death and desire, and you have to ask the question, basically what we are asking the question is this: how do we as human beings rationally act in the face of death and desire? How do we rationally act? Enough love stories show you the irrationality of one, and enough literature and philosophy shows you the irrationality of the other about death. Death becomes a very important point of various philosophical schools. I think it raises extremely important questions both from Indian and Western philosophy and so on. But it's also very interesting that these questions also have very deep significance for conceptual world of science. And all you have to do is to look at this wonderful history of ideas of the idea of infinity, and you will see how much the struggle about the conceptualization of the infinity, both as mathematical infinity and philosophical ideas of infinity, are all struggling with this fundamental condition of the human, which is our finitude. The fact that we all of us will only live for some time. And that idea of the finite, which is in us in various ways, Shankara has a very interesting thing about which often quoted, that he says, all of us keep living our lives without recognizing that we're all going to die. We keep, thinking that we never confront it, or the confrontation of death for Heidegger and the existentialists are very important themes for which philosophy happens. So these two are not in any sense, these two, I'm not, because of them people may get stressed and various things may happen. But as existential categories, these are extremely important, powerful concepts, and which makes us ask the question, how do we act? How do we rationally act in the face of death and desire? How do we socially make meaning of these? These are not just individual perceptions. If you look at modern medicine, for example, modern medicine's engagement with the question of death, prolonging death, overcoming the limits of death, are all about a particular way of responding to the theme of death. So there is a social response to the question of death, which is very important. There are social responses to what happens when communities are killed and various things happen of this kind. So there is this, the real question which really, to me, which becomes very important is this, and I will just, make this final point on this, which is that these states of death and desire have a very deep consequence on us, which is, I would want to call it as a human condition, but I may be using it very loosely, but that's okay. And the condition is that it makes humans vulnerable. We are vulnerable beings. We are vulnerable beings in the face of death and desire. And the question then, therefore, is, how do you act when you are vulnerable? I'm not trying to justify any of these acts which happen in these cases, whether the Bhutakolas or the superstitious acts. But I want to point out to you that when you are confronted with vulnerability, deep vulnerability, and you want to rationally act, how can you act? By saying this, I want to be very careful so that people do not misunderstand me, that I am trying to give a rationalization for superstition. That's not the point. In fact, it's very easy to give rationalizations for superstition, like psychological states. I'm trying to understand what is it in being human, the fundamental idea of being human, that when you are in a vulnerable state, or that you are vulnerable as a human, and not just how do I rationally act, how do I act? In fact, let me suggest to you that when I am vulnerable, I always and can only act rationally. It's impossible for you to act otherwise when you are in a state of vulnerability. Okay? What I'm trying to suggest to you is that the only time you can definitely know that you will act rationally, in what sense? In the senses I talked about, maybe a little more which I'll explain, is that when you are vulnerable. Vulnerability is the problem, because when you are vulnerable, you will suddenly say, no, I'm going to go pray something. I hope, when an operation is being done, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Or maybe you'll start tying something around you and rolling on the ground or whatever. Right? Because, these are examples which are used for the irrational. But I'm saying it's also in the moments of vulnerability that in some sense, that the set of actions which lead to your actions when you're confronting vulnerability is also rational. But rational in what sense? And that rationality is, in other words, existential rationality, vulnerability, humans respond to vulnerability by invoking imagination. And the whole theme of imagination is wonderful. Imagination is central to science, it's central to literature and so on. But imagination has something very important. One of the great characters of imagination, as described so wonderfully by the phenomenologist Husserl and onwards, to whom imagination is a positive power, if you like. And a very important aspect of imagination is that power in you which makes the absent present and the present absent. That's all. When you are vulnerable, when you know that the person you want in front of you is not there, what do? You imagine. Imagination becomes your way of coping with vulnerability. It becomes a way of you creating a world which will allow you to rationally survive your vulnerable moment. And that imagination, which is common, as I said, it's nothing special in vulnerable states, it's not special to superstition. It's the most powerful idea, which is the root of science. In fact, if you look at the 18th century discussion on imagination, that's the real problem. Modern science begins with this grand debate about imagination, because imagination was seen to cause mental illness, it also was seen as a mark of genius. So here was the idea of attempt to recapture imagination. In order to understand great science happens through imagination, but also completely delusional literature and artwork also arises through imagination. Delusion is not my description of literature and art, I'm just saying the way in that historical description of that. So here is, this question of this engagement with our vulnerable, the moment of confronting the vulnerable, one of the ways in which most of us do it, I'm not saying all of us do it, maybe the rational people may be different, I don't know. What humans do, I think, when you're faced with the notion of vulnerable, is to tell stories to survive. We tell stories. And the narrative element, the capacity to tell stories and use metaphors and use poetry in order to confront the vulnerability leads to a very serious, important consequence of an ethical rationality. And that is, so let me just read a paragraph of what I had been writing. I didn't want to read my paper, partly because it's not fully done. But let me just read this paper, because this paragraph. It's not a surprise that the most profound ways of dealing with death and desire have come from literature and art. The recent trend of powerful bestsellers of medical narratives has greatly influenced the literary field. The rationality of coping through telling. You cope with something through telling, and telling through a variety of forms is an important element of the rationality of human action. These stories, narratives, and metaphors generate an ethics which is based on the primacy of being and not on the primacy of knowing. And that's the ethical rationality I'm talking about. That is, a rationality which is not based on what I know, how I know, but on how I can be. I'll try and explain to you very quickly what it is. So these narratives and metaphors generate an ethics of, which is based on the primacy of being and not on the primacy of knowing. It is these rationalities, understood not as control and prediction, but as ethical and scientific at the same time, that is needed. Saying, quote, I am there for you, which I really don't normally like, because it's become such a, Archie card saying, but it's actually something very important in it. Saying I'm there for you is enough. And it's an ethical response because it is about being there for somebody. Family and friends are those whom you would like to be there for you. You may not even need them to do this or the other, but to be just there. So I'm asking, what is this human state of just being there? Haven't we had friends with whom we just want to be and not know about what that person is thinking? What are you doing? What did you eat? What did you do? I mean, you may not even know much about what you are with a particular person, but you have that moment of being with them. This sense of absence is this void of non-being, not being there when you want somebody to be there. We rationalize this non-being. I'm talking particularly about the question of death. We rationalize this non-being of the person who is not there before me through stories, metaphors, and narratives. These are the structures of justification of being and not of knowing. In fact, stories have to consciously present themselves as stories in that they do not want to be real. There is something very important in this human capacity, in the way we cope with vulnerability, in this primary existential condition, which we do by bringing up stories and metaphors and narratives to make sense of ourselves and to make sense of the vulnerable condition we are in. And that is a rational part of action. To say that it is irrational to engage in this metaphorical description of the absence before me is to miss a very important point of the rationality of human beings when confronted with these existential conditions. So, to me, therefore, to finally end with a very more meaningful thing rather than just talking about being and knowing, in a very, very specific way of looking at what do we do with this? I hope it's not like all philosophy talks at the end, you say, well, you said everything, you didn't say anything, kind of a thing, which might be true. I apologize in advance, Bhupendra, for that. But I will also try and tell you 2 lines of why it matters to all this. The whole thing matters to it, but let me summarize in 2 lines why it matters to all this, which is scientific rationality is an extremely important way of making sense of the world, even making sense of human action, describing how we act with each other and so on. It's just not enough. It's not enough, and what I'm trying to say is people react to this limitation of scientific rationality and continue these practices because it's very easy for them to debunk scientific rationality. Whereas, if you do, like what you have done in your own Samiti in terms of the rules, if you claim that this is also an ethical reason why this will not be done, it's not just scientific rationality, it's ethically irrational for you to do this. That's it. The moment you say that it is ethically irrational, you get away with the problem of science, because let us face this, however much we like science, science has had a historically deep problem with the question of ethics. You know, scientific rationality and ethical action towards human beings are, some people would say, are, you know, oxymoron. Because there is and in fact, a history of modern science begins with the removal of the question of ethics from modern science. You know, there's a long piece I wrote on ethics of curiosity, science and ethics of curiosity, where the only point I'm making is that when modern science becomes modern science historically, it does so by saying ethics is not a concern of science. It cannot be a concern of science, and therefore develops what we understand as modern science. So I am saying the point which what your Samiti is doing are very, very deeply important ethical action, which is absolutely must for a society to survive. And we should embrace that. Just like the Constitution embraces something called scientific temper, we need to embrace the fact that we will function ethically. There is a notion of ethical rationality which is based on particular notions of what it is to be human and how we socially act towards human rationally, and that therefore these are the principles under which we are going to fight all these social evils. By doing this, you negate 2 other things, which to me is very important. One, you take on board structural vulnerabilities, which makes people vulnerable, is because not, as you correctly said, poor people and others. It also does something which is extremely important, and today we cannot talk about, let me say very quickly, our idea of science and scientific rationality is very old. We have had science studies for 50, 60 years which have gone way beyond our understanding of what the constitutional scientific temper and scientific rationality is. One thing we have forgotten to do is to forget the fact that modern accounts of rationality take into account emotion and reason together. And the feminists have made the biggest noise about it for very correct reasons. In fact, to me, the greatest answer to these kinds of problems which is posed by what is social action, what is the rationality of social action, comes from the feminist critique of rationality and reason, when they point out the possibility of including reason within emotion and look at the rationalities based on that. We should also recognize, as I'm sure you do far better than I do, that most of these acts, very inhuman acts in society, are performed on women. And women are often seen to be the carriers of superstition and tradition because they are seen as carriers of tradition. Which means what we end up doing is we keep branding them as irrational superstition. They carry the burden of being superstitious in a society. In fact, how can that be possible? If we do not understand the reason for their action, in other words, to give you a broader definition of rationality which takes into this very important question, critiques of reason and emotion and action, which is based on being and not knowing. That's a very important, without essentializing women, the fact of being there as a very important part of this action. So I think, in my own way of understanding this, I think not only Dr. Dabholkar, but what you are doing and your Samiti is doing, and many of these groups which are working in India on trying to attack these kinds of, I think, inhuman conditions. I won't call it unscientific. I'm saying inhuman practices are doing it. The best way to attack them is, in return, is to invoke a larger complex of rationality which includes the scientific and the ethical together, which includes the possibility of reason and emotion together, which includes the possibility of ways of looking of the masculine and the feminine and the dispossessed. And if you don't have the marginalized as part of it, you cannot go anywhere with it. In fact, one of the greatest critiques of this scientific rationality has been the fact that for those whom we want to protect are also those who are not allowed entry into science. They cannot be allowed entry, they don't have the capacity. Now, these contradictions, I think, can be very usefully brought together in this social rationalities, which I said social science has engaged with deeply, ethical rationalities, which must become a way in which we use as a tool to encounter these, along with the fundamental sense which is present in scientific rationalities. We cannot afford to lose any of them at the cost of, because the cost of that is too much for our society. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.